Hello from the BBC in London. I'm Audrey Tinlin with Global View, a snapshot of how the world's media covered prominent American stories this week. Coming up, we'll hear how Chinese media have portrayed the Omicron wave of infections in the US. But first, President Biden's push for voting rights legislation was covered in France. This is France 24 reporting on the president's trip to Georgia. The reporter says Joe Biden chose the cradle of civil rights in America to pound his fist on the table. Meanwhile, the daily newspaper Corse Matin covered the speech by Arizona Senator Kyrsten Sinema opposing rule changes in the Senate to get the bill passed. The headline of that article was, "Biden risks dismal failure on sweeping electoral reform." The US is breaking its own records for daily coronavirus infections, something the Chinese state media have been reporting this week. At the same time, several Chinese cities, millions of people have been forced to stay home by their government as China pursues a zero-COVID strategy. Kerry Allen follows China for BBC Monitoring, which scans the media and social media around the world. I asked her what the Chinese state-controlled media are telling the public about COVID in the US.
Well, throughout the pandemic, Chinese media have very much wanted to paint a doomsday image of how the US has been handling the coronavirus. But it has really felt in the last week that it's really stepped up a gear with this. There have been lots of reports talking about how there have been serious supply shortages at supermarkets, words like grim pandemic record talking about cases surging, really emphasising that there are critical staff shortages and painting an image for people in China of the idea that the US has spiralled out of control and that cases are just growing and growing. They're also talking specifically about child cases increasing exponentially and saying that this is really affecting kids.
And with China now experiencing its own outbreak of Omicron, what are Chinese people saying, particularly on social media? They're having new restrictions on their lives. What are they saying about that?
Governments all over China, when handling with this new variant, they're responding in a much quicker way, and actually it's catching people off guard, and people are finding that these lockdowns are leaving them no time whatsoever to prepare. So I've seen stories, for example, of a woman going on a blind date and after her blind date finding out that she can't leave her potential suitor's house because the community has gone into lockdown, so she's been living at his house for a number of days. Also a story of a man who was in the middle of a house move, and this new building that he was moving into went into lockdown while he was moving his furniture, and he couldn't even get a quilt from his car because he was told that there were absolutely no exceptions, you have to lock down. So we have seen stories of people getting very, very frustrated that these restrictions are so strict.
Kerry Allen. And the media across Ukraine were focused on this week's talks between the US and Russia. The US wants Russia to withdraw its troops from the border with Ukraine, while Russia wants a limit on NATO expansion. Ukrainian media were largely positive about the US position in the talks, despite there not being any agreement between the two sides. This reporter for Ukraine's 1+1 network notes that US negotiator Wendy Sherman again threatened Moscow with serious consequences. And that's what some of the world's media had to say this week. I'm Audrey Tinlin at the BBC.